The movie opens with Meg, a Nantucket bookshop owner, gathering and wrapping books up for her book club. She picks different books up, carefully packaging them with brown papers, writing a description for each of the books, sealing them with tape, and tying them with ropes. Meg is seen slowly riding her bicycle, heading to her bookstore. She arrives, carries the basket from her bicycle containing the books, and walks into her shop. Alice, Meg's friend and business partner who is pregnant, sees Meg and compares two kinds of seafood together, with which Meg disagrees. Meg tells Alice that they need to keep the comparison conversation away for a more important one, like her aunt's visit to her bookstore. Her aunt wants to come see her because it's been 3 years and she wants to check the bookstore as well. But Meg is scared that her Auntie Renee won't like the new changes in the bookstore and will surely make lots of complaints. Alice tries to convince Meg not to worry, stating that her aunt will surely love everything, especially her blind date book club. Meg runs towards Alice, correcting her and saying what she is into is actually a blind date with a book club. Alice tries to be optimistic that her friend is doing really well. That's why the famous national public radio presenter, Renee Bream, wants to interview her about her books. Just then, Renee walks into the store and overhears the conversation going on. Alice and Meg quickly turn towards the door in surprise and suggest to each other that it's time for them to put a doorbell to alert them of the customer's entrance. Meg welcomes Renee and tells her she didn't expect her to be this early, but Renee defends herself, saying she's right on time and not late or early. Renee pulls her jacket off and hands it over to Meg. She moves towards the table where she wants to set up her recording instruments. The next scene shows Graham Sterling meeting with Terrence to review his book. Terrence tells Graham that his book is good, but he just doesn't love it. The look on Graham's face changes from a happy one to a look filled with disappointment from the comment made by Terrence about his book. He asks for Terrence's reason, and Terrence informs him that he has written a romance, but his target audience is not women. Graham gets confused about Terrence's idea of his book and helps clarify that it isn't romance, but a historical epic centered around a love story. Terrence surprises that what makes Graham excel in the industry more is writing books relating to the world and science. Graham cuts him off and lets Terrence know that he's going to wait for Miranda to review it. Terrence breaks it to him that Miranda likes the book, but sadly, she says she's not going to publish it either. Graham tells Terrence not to bother, that he's going to publish it himself since no one wants to help him out positively. Terrence questions him about his recent choice and how he's going to go about it. But Graham explains to Terrence that he's going to publish it under a pseudonym and call himself Dylan Turner. Terrence notifies him that the book isn't going to go anywhere without a famous name recognition, but Dylan tells him that he's going to let the readers of the book decide that. Dylan lets Terrence know that he wants to try something new and different than the usual niche he created for himself and the teenagers who are his audience. He believes he's going to thrive in this new direction too and succeed, but Terrence seems to lack faith in him and trust him. The next scene shows Meg being interviewed by Renee Bream, the radio presenter. Renee introduces her location to her audience and questions Meg about her bookstores named Mimi's Book Corner, asking her what brought about Mimi when her name is Meg. Meg leans forward to the microphone and explains everything to Renee, letting her know that she inherited the bookstore from her mom, who started the business before she was born. Renee keeps questioning her about the store, and Meg continues to lean forward and reply, giving Renee a chance to caution her about leaning forward. Meg frowns when Renee calls her blind date with book club a dating craze and tries to clear the idea Renee has about her bookstore business, and it's fun. In the next scene, Graham is seen driving while talking to his sister, Lizzie, on the phone. Lizzie's kids try to interrupt the phone call, and Graham seeks to find out if it's the right time for them to talk. He tells his sister about his desire to create something new other than the usual, and she assures him that he is a great writer and seller of his books, and he is surely going to thrive on it. As Graham ends the call with his sister, he listens to the interview by Renee Bream with Meg about Meg's bookstore. In the interview, Meg lets Renee know that her book business is more about the materials and finding someone who shares a similar mindset and ideas, not purely about love. This statement amazes Graham as he smiles and carefully listens to the interview. At the ferry terminal, Meg is on a phone call, asking for the whereabouts of her aunt. Graham walks past her, searching around and trying to find the signboard of Nantucket. A French woman approaches Meg and pleads with her to take a photo of her and her family. Meg calls Graham's attention so he can excuse himself from photobombing the French family's photo. The French woman thanks Meg for her cute pictures and tells her and Graham to stand together for a photo as well. Aunt Renee arrives and Meg runs to hug her. Renee tells her how much she has missed Meg and Nantucket as a whole. At the bookstore, Alice shares her fears with Meg of not being able to complete her book before giving birth, but Meg assures her that she trusts her abilities and she will surely be able to pull through. Meg steps out with a carton box in her hand containing books and bumps into Graham, who comes in to search for books. They both smile and greet themselves, while Alice pops out and secretly asks Meg if she is acquainted with Graham, but Meg quickly brushes her off. Graham asks Meg if she owns the store. He also reveals he has been listening to the radio, and he further seeks to see the wrapped books with amazing descriptions on them. Meg leads the way and shows him the books available. Graham commends Meg for always trying to promote unknown and underappreciated books and local authors as well. He asks her if she would love to display his self-published book in her book club, and Meg breaks it to him that she has a lot of publishers already and the month is occupied, but if he is still in Nantucket later on and he really wants her help, she will surely render it to him. Graham hands over his book to Meg and pleads with her to take a look at the book and read through the content, because he really needs to know her thoughts and the review of the book. Still, at the bookstore, Aunt Renee comes in and sees Meg. She notices the changes in the bookstore, and Meg hopes it's all positive changes and not negative. Renee goes out with Meg for a coffee, and as they walk together, she tells Meg how proud she is of her. She informs Meg of her plans to travel while she still can. Aunt Renee also tries to make Meg change her dream from the bookstore to going back to her real estate job, but it is all to no avail as Meg remains adamant about remaining a bookshop owner. As Meg prepares to sleep, she gets a text message from Alice, who wants to find out what Renee said. This makes Meg unable to sleep as she goes to the sitting room and picks up Graham's book, reading every content and detail in it. Graham is shown on the phone with Terrence. He tells Terrence that he is stuck, and Terrence misunderstands him and thinks Graham is having writer's block and just needs to clear his head. Terrence notifies Graham that he has 3 weeks left to finish the project, and with a confusing look, Graham tells Terrence it's 5 weeks left. Terrence brushes Graham off, telling him he has been busy chasing a new form of creativity to the point of forgetting deadlines. At the bookstore, Graham offers to pay Meg for her time to read his book, but she lets him know she is done with the reading of his book. Graham seeks to know her perspective on it and if she can promote it in her book club, but unfortunately, Meg says it isn't their kind of book at the book club because of the romance embedded in it. Graham's frustration increases as he wonders why everyone thinks it's a pure romantic book he wrote and not a historical epic centered around a love story. Just then, Alice comes in and walks towards the staircase. Graham informs Meg of his position on the bestsellers list, and with a confusing look, she tells him she hasn't heard of the name Dylan Turner on the list. Graham finally opens up to her that he is Graham Sterling. This comes as a surprise to Alice, who is heading upstairs, and she takes a pause and turns to head down back. Alice walks over to Meg and Graham and excuses Graham so she can talk to Meg. Alice succeeds in changing the mind of Meg as she finally agrees to wrap Graham's book for Dylan Turner's debut novel. Graham and Meg sit at the table outside the bookstore and discuss what Graham is to expect from the book club he is joining. Alice walks in on them, and Meg officially introduces her to Graham as an aspiring writer. Graham reads the description on his wrapped book and laughs at it, saying it sounds like a dating profile. This pisses Meg off as she feels people keep misunderstanding the idea of her book club, just like Raina did. Graham quickly apologizes to her. After seeing the strong expression on her face, Meg goes on to ask Graham if he's a fast reader, and he assures her he has always been a very fast reader to the point of holding a record back in college. Meg asks Alice out for lunch, and at the table, Meg tells Alice about her fears of what people would think if she sold the book from Graham. Alice comforts her friend and tells her to just be herself and not care about what others will think. At the book club with everyone, Meg introduces a book to them, and 2 members, Stacy and Jackson, seem to share similar ideas about themselves in the book. This puts a smile on Graham's face. After the event, the members exit and Graham goes to thank Meg with a bouquet. He commends Meg for making a very honest opinion and critique of his book. Graham offers to pay Meg so she can review more of his books, but she disagrees, saying she isn't an editor, and he really should let the entire members of the book club decide what they think about the book. Graham finally listens to Meg, but tells her he would love to do a book signing with his fans in Nantucket before he leaves the town, and Meg agrees to his idea. Meg is seen sitting in a standard and colorful office. Her former colleague approaches her with a coffee and asks Meg if she noticed the big difference between the old office and this new one. She hopes that the beauty of the new office will entice Meg to come back and work with them again. Graham is at the coffee shop. While trying to order his coffee, he sees Alice working on her laptop and walks up to her. As he calls her name out, she stutters, and he asks her if she's writing, but she tells him she doesn't know what to call it when it's not paying her. Graham advises her to be optimistic and continue doing what she loves, and she tells him to do the same as well. The next scene shows Meg wrapping and stacking Graham's book at the bookstore for people to pick. She assures Graham that whatever genre he chooses to write, his true fans will always support him. Meg sets an appointment with Graham on Tuesday at 10 a.m. for the discussion of Dylan's novel. Alice gives Meg a thumbs up for cheering Graham on. Graham calls his sister Lizzie and notices the silence in the background, prompting him to ask about her daughters. She tells him they went out with their dad, and she's having a peaceful time at home alone. Graham chooses to whisper to her so as to not ruin her quiet time. Lizzie commends his work once again, and this made Graham really happy. After the call, he looks at his phone and orders amazing dishes. In the morning, Lizzie rushes down to prepare breakfast for her girls and hears the doorbell ring. She goes to check who it is and warns her daughters not to dare move an inch. Lizzie opens the door and sees a basket of food at her front. She sees a letter placed in it and picks it up to read. The message embedded sends smiles to Lizzie's face, as she can tell it's from her brother. Graham walks towards the bookstore and sees Meg sitting outside and ready for the 10 a.m. discussion they set together. Meg takes him to a spot by the ocean and tells him that it has been her favorite spot since she was little. Graham seeks to know how Meg switched from being a realtor to a book expert, and Meg corrects him, saying her mom was the expert, not her. She took the business up when her mom got sick. Graham goes further to ask her if she wants to go back to being a realtor in Boston, but Meg disagrees, saying she feels her mom's presence here in Nantucket and in a bookstore, and she isn't ready to let her go. Graham assures her that wherever she is and whatever she chooses to become, her mom will surely be there with her. Meg tells him that she has read his book several times, but decided to read it again today, and now she can see why people love his book so much. It is because it makes them feel a certain lived experience. They are both on cloud 9 as they smile together and admire the nature and art around them. Meg and Graham go into a wine shop, and Meg picks up a bottle of wine. Graham asks her if it's for the book club that night, and he tells her that he hopes it's going to be a hit. His statement makes Meg question him about his plan to be absent. Graham explains to her that he wasn't invited, and she informs him that all he has to do is read the book, which is going to be discussed that night. Graham gets excited and excuses himself to go read the book and prepare for the event. Graham sits at a table reading and sees other people reading the same book as him. He smiles, knowing fully well that they are all for the book club. Meg is shown trying to make up her mind on what to wear. She finally decides to wear a pretty white top. At the event, Meg approaches Alice and asks her if she has noticed that they've got more guests than usual. Alice spots Graham walking in and notifies Meg. Graham hands over a bottle of wine to Meg and asks her out for dinner, and she accepts. At the restaurant, Meg praises Graham for being able to bring them into such a big restaurant with a whole lot of protocols. They go ahead to discuss themselves and their family as well, as Graham tells Meg about his sister and her 2 beautiful girls. The waiter brings the dessert of lobster ice cream to them. Graham takes a spoon and asks Meg to take 1 too to rate it as well. Meg goes ahead and rates it 3 out of 10, and Graham questions her for still eating it when it's so bad. She laughs, saying she doesn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and Graham forces himself to ask her why she was very honest in criticizing him and not the restaurant. This makes Meg open up to Graham as she tells him it's because she's just comfortable with him, and that's the reason. Graham offers to walk Meg home, and on getting there, he compliments her house and thanks her for everything and all the nice things she said earlier. Graham asks her if she would love to go on a date with him again, and she smiles and agrees to his request with the condition that there will be no book talk. They share a kiss and bid each other goodnight. At night, Graham texts Meg and romantically asks her for the photo at the Nantucket sign that joined the both of them together. Raina texts Meg too and informs her that she will visit the book club to get something. The next day, Meg is seen pacing around being all nervous as she turns to Graham to find out why he is calm about this whole thing with Raina when his true identity is at stake and he might be exposed, and now she has to lie to the public too. Graham tells her to remain calm because a lot of writers use pseudonyms. Just then, Aunt Renee walks in and Graham excuses himself for the two to talk. Renee asks Meg if she finally agrees to sell the bookstore, but Meg pushes the conversation away and tells her aunt that they will talk about that later. Alice tries to set up the chairs for the book club when Graham calls out to her and gives her a motivational book to cheer her on now. She thanks him and tries to verify her observations pertaining to Graham's book. Alice asks Graham about his constant connection with apples in all his books, so Graham tells her he didn't notice that and thanks her for her honest observation. At the bookstore, Alice distributes drinks for the book club members coming into the bookstore, and Meg approaches her saying she has fears about Graham, who is top on the booksellers list around Raina now. The next scene shows Terrence on a call with Graham. He notifies Graham about the deadline for the submission of his story at hand. Graham excuses himself and tells Terrence that he needs to go attend a book club. Terrence is surprised as he wasn't aware that Graham now attends a book club. Meg sees Graham sitting alone outside and decides to send him motivational quotes to keep him going. As everyone gathers inside, including Raina Breen, Meg addresses them and introduces Raina to the club members. Raina talks about how happy she is and how the listeners loved the last interview she did with them. She also asks for their permission to record the new session today. Raina turns to Graham and tells him that he looks familiar to her, but he quickly brushes it off. Meg insists they begin the review for the book and asks someone to start first. All members of the club, except Alice, Meg, and Graham, make bad comments about Graham's book. Meg cuts them off by letting them open the doors and go for a tea break. Raina approaches Stacy and Jackson and questions them about their relationship, and it was formed from the book club. Graham walks to meet Meg and tells her he's getting bad comments, but she tells him not to worry because they only heard from a few people. Just then, Jackson turns the back of a book and sees Graham's picture on it. He calls on Graham, alerting every other person. Raina smiles and says she knows he is a famous person, and others ask him why he is at the book club. Graham mistakenly leaks his big secret by opening up to everyone that he wrote the romantic novel they hate. Renee gets pissed off as she feels Meg is only trying to promote the book because Graham is her friend. Stacy asks Graham when the next episode of his drama will be released, or if he has chosen to completely abandon that one for romance. With much pressure and argument in the bookstore, Meg announces to everyone that she has chosen to sell the bookstore. This comes as a surprise to everyone, including Aunt Renee and Raina as well. She asks everyone to pack their things and leave and assures them she's going to put them in good hands. Graham walks towards her and apologizes. She asks him not to. After all, she brought him into the club. Graham tries to render help to Meg, but with tears trying to form in her eyes, she tells him she wants everyone, including him, to leave because she has a lot of mess she has to clean up. In the next scene, with tears in her eyes, Aunt Renee is seen looking at the photo album of the opening of the bookstore with Meg's mom holding the scissors. The next day, she packs her belongings and goes to meet Meg. Renee tells Meg that her mom will surely be proud of how the store is now. So many people are in love with the books and the life and effort Meg puts into them. Renee hands over the photo album to Meg and bids her farewell. Just then, Meg sees Stacy and Jackson holding hands and walking together, and she smiles at them. Graham calls his sister and tells her everything about work and the progress in the last writing he's currently on. He tells Lizzie that her kids are really awesome and they take after her. In the next scene, Meg opens the photo book and sees the short message written by her aunt to her about her mother. She smiles and heads over to her favorite spot around the ocean. Graham is shown working at the cafe, and he turns and sees the people around him all happy and reading. On a video call with Graham, Terrence expresses his joy about Graham's new episode with the genre he's known for. He commends him for the ending of the story where a boy shares an apple with his friend. Graham tells Terrence that he was inspired by an aspiring writer who he is going to introduce to Terrence soon. Terrence informs Graham that after his 8th book settles down, he can go back to writing historical fiction. He apologizes to Graham for trying to limit his creativity. On a phone call, Meg tells her ex-colleague that Boston deserves someone who is full-time because if she's there, she won't fully be able to focus on work and would be distracted. Thinking about the bookstore, Meg walks into the bookstore and sees Alice and Graham. Alice excuses herself and Meg asks Graham his reason for being around today. Graham tells Meg that he told his nieces about her and they both love her. Meg gets excited that Graham did that. She informs Graham of her decision to keep the bookstore and not move to work in Boston. She always wanted to do something special, but she didn't realize she was doing it already, and the bookstore is where her happiness lies. Meg slowly walks towards Graham and tells him he's special to her as well, and the blind date book club truly can bring two people together. Graham leans forward and kisses her on her lips.